Today, I will be discussing a study that looks at how many non-elite endurance athletes do not meet sports nutrition recommendations for carbohydrates. With the increase in social media, endurance events such as triathlons, marathons, and more are quickly gaining popularity, especially amongst non-elite athletes. The study examined the diets of these athletes competing in endurance races and looked at the protein and carbohydrate intakes leading up to the race, taking into account event type and sex. The study was conducted because almost no research has been conducted on non-elite athletes competing in endurance races. The study allows these athletes to have knowledge on how to safely and properly fuel for these long distances. It was hypothesized that these athletes met the recommended protein and carbohydrate intake. Researchers recruited athletes who were participating in 5 different multi-sport endurance races and were at least 18 years of age. For the study, they looked at 297 athletes and instructed the athletes to complete online questionnaires that asked socio-demographic information, medical conditions, food frequency questionnaires, and sports, food, and supplement questionnaires. From these surveys, the researchers were able to gather energy and macronutrient intakes, average nutritional values, and performance rank. In Table 1, we see that researchers examined the different characteristics observed within the participants to take into account the different variables like age, gender, employment status, training time, intensity, and strength percentage. In Table 2, we see researchers examined the self-reported dietary intake of these athletes between the different races. Total energy intake of IM triathlon athletes was higher than in winter and IM 70.3 athletes. Carbohydrate intake was higher in the IM athletes comparatively, when intake was higher in WCIM 70.3 and IM athletes than winter athletes. Dietary fat contributed to more energy intake in WCIM 70.3 athletes. And lastly, alcohol intake contributed to greater energy intake in the winter and IM 70.3 athletes than in the IM athletes. In Table 3, we see that only 45% of athletes reported consuming the recommended intake of carbohydrates, which is 6 grams per kilogram of body weight. 87% reported consuming the lowest recommended intake of protein, which is 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, and 66.4% reported consuming the higher recommended intake of protein, which is 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. From figures 1 and 2, we see that approximately 25% of non-elite athletes are not achieving the recommended carbohydrate intake. Athletes meeting the recommended carbohydrate intake were predominantly those competing in the IM triathlon. However, all these athletes consumed at least 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. The IM and WCIM 70.3 athletes were not more likely to consume more than 6 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight. There was no difference among multi-sport groups for meeting the recommended 1.2 kilograms of protein per kilogram of body weight. From this data, we see that energy intake is a key component in achieving recommended carbohydrate and protein intake, and that most athletes are getting recommended protein intake but not carbohydrate intake. When analyzing the data, we see that only 46% of participants reported eating the daily recommended intake of carbohydrates. 88% of males and 84% of females met the lower limit of protein intake. 70% of men and 56% of women met the upper limit of protein intake. And finally, athletes competing in the IM triathlon were more likely to meet the upper limits of protein and carbohydrate needs than those competing in the IM 70.3 and winter triathlon. In the study, it's important to note a few things. Due to the self-reporting energy intake, there could have been under and overestimation of food. Additionally, these results were more of a generalization due to the lack of recruitment of different athletes through an emailing list. However, from the data, we can see that athletes who are under consuming carbohydrates may be at risk for impaired immune function, which can contribute to lack of quality in training and performance, and that energy intake is the main factor of predicting protein and carbohydrate intake. The main takeaway from this study is that not enough non-elite athletes are getting the recommended serving of carbohydrates. However, they are getting adequate amounts of protein. It's possible the recommended intake of carbohydrates may need to be adjusted for non-elite athletes. However, more research needs to be done to accurately say. Lastly, there needs to be more nutritional education to ensure that these athletes are safe. For the average athlete who wants to start a challenge such as an endurance race, it is imperative that they are educated on how to fuel properly for such an extreme endeavor. A non-elite athlete needs to make sure they are consuming adequate carbohydrates and protein to prevent injury and illness and maximize their performance. Some ways in which non-elite athletes can get support is through working with a dietitian or nutritionist or educating themselves on how to properly fuel. And these are my references. Thank you so much.